Welcome to the Going Green podcast. Today we're going to try and tackle the problem about who should actually set climate targets. Now, should it be the scientists? Should it be the people? Should it be governments? Could it be individuals setting their own climate targets? Companies setting their climate targets? Global companies, because they could really do a lot of good. Perhaps countries, or should it be people like the world, the UN?
Well, I can tell you that technically it is actually the UN who have agreed that two things. Firstly, that climate change is a problem and it's a problem we should fix. That's the important thing. Establishing we've got it's you follow the stages of what being of when you're having a problem. You gotta admit you have a problem even before you start dealing with you having a problem. Because that's one of the major problems we were suffering is that so many people were denying there was an issue, but people have now finally agreed that we've got a problem.
Yeah, but it's only become a problem since things have really started to happen. We've actually had this problem for years, and a lot of it was led by scientists coming up with data. The first one that you probably remember, Paul, is the hole in the ozone layer. It went big about, we got a hole in the ozone layer. How did this happen? What can we do about it? What should we be doing about it? Because we should be doing something about it. And they've been wittering on about scientists, about wittering on about various things happening. I remember when I was in school several hundred years ago, I believe that probably was. And we were talking about running out of oil and the amount of problems we were going to have. Not the teacher was saying he wasn't going to have any problems because he was going to be dead. But we were going to have the problems. We were going to have climate change. We were going to have lack of resources. We were going to have too much population. And everyone just said, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you hear all these lovely things and they go in the future things would be bad, but for now it's all right. And the answer is, I can't do. And it's human nature that you can't really focus on the future. You've got to focus on the here and now, and that's why it's hard to do all these things. And that's why we're trying to not change, but we're trying to say there is this issue and the problem of which we need to solve these problems. Now, the major, I say, problems of all this is that people don't like change. And I say people, it's more of the fact that, say, let's take a large company.
But it's everyone.
Everyone.
That's what you mean, isn't it? Yeah.
But it's say a large company, it's making a nice profit on things, and suddenly it's, let's say making cardboard boxes, right? And suddenly it can't make any new cardboard boxes. That's a problem for the company, right? And they've got an existential crisis, which is effectively what all the stuff is happening. If we don't keep the climate down, keep the temperature low, then suddenly all these companies have problems in trying to give us stuff because look, we won't be around.
Or things aren't available, or they're much more expensive. We're seeing not just the cost of climate change, but we're seeing how the weather is actually being affected. Climate change is a very long, slow, gradual thing where we're just saying, well, it's sort of 1 degree warmer now than it was so many years ago. Yeah, that doesn't mean anything. Weather, however, is much more here and now. And we're seeing, because of droughts, wildfires, we're seeing floods because of torrential low depressions coming through. We're seeing high winds, tornadoes damaging things. We're seeing perhaps sea levels rise, ice caps melting, icebergs on the loose. That's more weather. And people can see that, but until that sort of thing starts to happen, I suppose climate change doesn't mean anything.
No, it's a struggle for most people because if the iceberg, if you're not a ship traveling through iceberg-ridden ocean waters, then the icebergs don't problem matter.
Yeah,
Yeah,
if I live in the tropics, yes, I'm not exactly bothered by icebergs, isn't it? That's the whole point.
no, and the major point of Chris, all this is goes. You hear the things that it's only 1 degree. Now that's great, 1 degree, but it's such a big difference. Now moving up back on to topic, more shall I say, is sort of so the UN said there's a problem and that we should do something about it. And of course, the UN's made up of lots of different countries, and so basically, all the countries sort of got together and said, what can we do to stop climate change? That's fair. And effectively, they looked at, well, what's the main causes of climate change, and is this atmospheric CO2 concentration? Uh,
Yeah,
and so this is where they moved through, and they managed to say, right, in Paris, we'll sign an agreement that says all countries in the world must decrease their CO2 emissions. I think it's something daft like 30%. It was something major, but
yeah, and most countries signed up to it.
yes, they did.
But
Yeah.
signing up to it didn't mean anything, did it? They put their name on it. Oh, we've missed the target. Oh dear. We've signed up to halt the climate change at 1.5 degrees, but most countries haven't. So who does really set these climate targets? Well, the scientists are those that are coming in with all the data.
Yes.
They're the ones that are sitting there with their instruments. They're measuring the weather. They're measuring how much of this, that, and the other, what causes this. And they're coming in with the raw data, and they can analyze that raw data, and they can say X, Y, Z. But then who's going to set their climate targets from that? So it's going straight then to the UN. The UN are, with their scientists, are then putting out this information, and the countries are then signing on the dotted line.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I have a big problem with this, that the country signed up, but a country is made up from individuals, and it's also made up from the not just the individuals, but the companies that represent the countries and do things for the country. And unless those individuals are on board with this climate change, and unless the companies are on board with this climate change, then if the governments there set targets, is it going to work? It's just going to be, oh, well, yeah.
Well, you just take the critical thing of the EU is currently taking 20, I think it's 22 countries to court about their climate targets, as in,
They're not doing enough.
well, they're not doing that. The answer is they were told that they needed to reach these targets, and well, they haven't. So there needs to be punishment for failing to reach a target. Yeah, it's sort of, you set a goal and you fail to reach the goal. So whose fault is this? There needs to be some recompense, someone to blame for all this, which is what they're trying to do. So that encouraging them to actually say make a goal and actually achieve it, rather than set a goal and just let it fade away. No need to hit the target. Well,
Yeah. But there are some countries that don't even bother to set the targets, or they set such wishy-washy long distance targets that it doesn't make any difference.
wasn't it India who set something like 20 by 2080 or something that they be carbon neutral, and or was it China? I can't remember. Anyway, but it was such a sort of delicate, fine balance of we commit to doing something, but not
Yeah.
yet, or not.
And then we looked at Delhi last year that had to close the schools for several days because of the smog was so bad. And is it a case they haven't put two and two together? They haven't actually worked out, what's causing the problem? Or are they just burying their heads in the sand and saying it doesn't matter?
Well, one of the major problems you find, and we've got this now in the US, is the motivation of to do things. So, is it profitable to set targets and achieve them? Yeah, that's always been
Mm,
the major point about all this. But it lies in the fact that there's why, you have to spend more money so you can make things cleaner, greener, and nicer, as opposed to being dirt cheap and buying, so therefore, you ask this question, or sort of, do you want something clean and green? Well, it's not going to be cheap. And the answer is, well, that's the problem. You see, things, why isn't it cheap to make something green? Oh, well, we haven't developed technology, or there must be a better way, or we haven't come up with it. There are so many excuses along that line. And it's one of those things where, no, excuses are fine. We don't mind say there hasn't been, we haven't developed the technology, or it's not around, or as they say, what was it for the famous quote? Today's problems will be solved by tomorrow's solutions, or something. Isn't it? By, I think
yeah.
Mr. Einstein. Yes. Uh, so you got those situations, and someone's at the door. Um, I'm just hitting buttons around me. So you've got all these issues around that. These things aren't cheap. Therefore, there's only big companies with a lot of money can actually do these solutions. And unfortunately, although the big guys do they're large, they take up a large chunk of the pie of the overall economy, or that they're actually, although they're a big slice, the smaller slices actually make up more. So,
Yeah.
then you got the problem of, do you share your technology, and then who owns the rights? And then, but people want benefits. I created this, I spent all this money, I want the benefits of this technology, or more precisely, if I'm going to give it away, I want to receive benefits from those small companies who use my technology. It's all this sort of, I need to gain something from it, as opposed to doing it for the right reasons, or the right things. So,
Yeah. Trouble is, a lot of these targets that are set are all voluntary, aren't they, really? They're more ideas, they're more sort of vague. We are going to be better, we're going to do this, but only some countries have actually enshrined it in law to actually say we will do this. Some of the most ambitious targets really are needed to keep us below, I think, not just 1.5, but 2. So I don't think we're going to actually hit the 1.5 degree sort of limit. They set that in Paris, and nobody's done enough.
no, they haven't. And as I said, this is the whole why the EU taking all the countries to court to provide punishment for failing to meet these targets. And loads of people saying, but why should these countries be punished when they've been spending out so huge amounts of euros in developing technologies, and admittedly, some of them haven't been successful. You try an idea and it's not successful. Well, is that a waste? Well, we learned that that's not possible, and yet I'm being punished for spending money on an idea that should look practical, unworthy, but it just wasn't feasible. And so their issue is, they're being punished for trying all these things, when they really said, look, it was more, they tried and attempted, they failed, but that doesn't mean they should stop doing that. It's one of those things where they almost should be rewarded for putting that money in and defining all these ideas. How many times, how many light bulbs were created before one lit up? And the answer is,
Lots.
lots. And so finding the solution is harder, and so you're punishing people for on those failures of finding a solution, as opposed to directly saying, we commend you for putting in, almost want a scoreboard, but the other way around, instead of a punishment board, you want to praise those ones going further and
Well,
doing things.
isn't that then about trying to get basically the individuals on board? The country may set targets, but they can set targets perhaps that are achievable by all the individuals. There are certain targets that are set out by the government for local government on things like recycling, of trying to get rid of some of these bits and pieces to stop the pollution, to stop the plastics, which will in fact clean up the planet and have either a direct or indirect effect on climate change. You can try and do various bits and pieces. Here in this council, and I moan about our council quite a lot, but in good news from our council, they collect a lot of the food waste, and that is then turned into useful things such as sort of compost, which they can sell. If they don't do that, it just goes in a dustbin, and that bin goes into landfill, and then a lot of that will turn into methane or carbon dioxide and then be just chucked out in the atmosphere. So local government can take a role here on directing the people, but it's still trying to get the people on board. And is that not just the role perhaps of teachers and education and television and YouTube?
Well, yes, exactly. It is one of those things where it is, do you persuade the individual to then persuade the, I say the executive branch? And it's one of those things where you persuade your elected officials to, who should represent your opinions and your voice, to actually say, I want you to care more about climate, and then subsequently they might care more about, and then things might happen more readily. You see, it's all this sort of chain of events, following down of, they represent your voice, and you should ask the, make them do your work for them, because that's what you've elected them to do, as opposed to doing whatever they want. Now, I want to set you. How do you actually set? Let's now talking about the individual. How do you set a a climate target, or part of these things?
Well, I would think that one of the best ways of doing this is that the government set a target and they say that you've got to do this. They then put in the means that you can do this. Let's take a simple one on reducing the amount of waste food. So the government say, here is the bill, the Get Rid of Waste Food Act. We then have the local governments who will try to basically support and enforce that sort of action. So they could provide the bins and the collection and the sort of get other companies on board to actually do the processing of the food into sort of something less toxic. It would work. And then you've got to have some sort of policing system. And I don't mean the police here, but you've got to have some way of enforcing to try and get people to actually do this job.
Yeah.
And then they start to do it. But a lot of that comes not from just the government saying, we're going to do this with a heavy hand, but it also comes from the softly approach, the way of trying to educate people. And that is in the media, papers, TV, as as most of my students remind me, yeah, they learn more from YouTube than they ever do from anything in the classroom. So, bases like YouTube and
Listening to this
other ones
podcast.
apply. Yes.
Yes. Now, what the thing I was actually talking about is, what, as before you can set a target, you actually need to know how much emissions
Yes.
you produce. This is the whole one of those odd things where you, instead of just saying we're going to reduce it by 50%, reduce what by 50? If you actually set a target and set a thing of sort of doing it, let's take waste food. How much waste food does we throw out? You need to look and investigate that. This is the whole,
Yeah.
what's
So they
like
have to say that so far we produce X number of tons, and our target is now we're only going to produce
half of that, or
yeah, half
a
that.
number of it. Yes.
Yeah.
And so then it's a sort of say, well, how we, almost like in an experiment, you've got to set up how are you going to do it? What's your method of doing reducing it? Waste food, to recycle it, or we're going to sort of say, make sure all these things, set up some plans and ideas of how to do something, and then it's to do it, and then but it's to communicate how well you're doing. You take fundraisers. How do fundraisers communicate how much money they've donated? And they just put a lovely stack of pile of sort of, you know, here's our jar. When we fill it, that's how much money we make. It's but the thing about the jar is that it's on view. It can be seen. You can see how much progress you've been making, which is one of those odd things where you hear the climate goals, you see all this stuff happen, but you don't actually
So
see.
you're saying we not just have to set targets, we've actually got to make them visible, and we can see how we're progressing with this. Yeah, I've seen various things where somebody wants to raise money to do something, and you see the little bar chart somewhere and say we've got a third of the way there so far. And it's to keep people informed about what's going on.
Yes, but it's more in relation to the fact that if people see it and it's visible, then but more importantly, let's say they take their bin of waste food and they pour it away. Is it one of those things where does that jar fill up more? Can they actually see their action towards the community goal or the large goal at hand actually makes a difference, as opposed to just saying, "Oh, not really." I've done this, but what was the point? There's no real, as I said, no real benefit, or no benefit to be seen, which is the other clear point. There doesn't have to be, you know, if the benefit's not known, or it has is seen to be a benefit, then no one knows it's a benefit. So what's the point? You've got to persuade people that it is a benefit, and then it gets a bit worrisome.
Well, let's look at an odd way of setting a target, which is actually not setting a target, which is something like the cost of fuel. Now, what actually controls the cost of fuel? And this is set by companies effectively because they've got to dig it up, extract it, move it, refine it, get it out, and they can say it's going to cost us so much money to do that. With that, it's all mixed in because governments like to take their little bit of tax, and they've also got other sort of organizations that are basically also saying, well, we can't sell for less than this. We've got to keep a minimum price on doing this. But if you've got then fuel prices rising, then that's going to drive people not to use that fuel or find basically more money so they can afford to buy the fuel. So let's suppose they can't afford to buy that fuel, then we've got to have either that's persuading people perhaps to use less, or you can provide, as a government, cheaper forms like basically renewable forms. And that way we can get change happening
Yeah,
and get people going along with us.
yeah. I don't quite. It's one of those odd things where there's a whole major problem in the fuel price in relation to you've got your costs that don't change. Price of refuel, not refueling, refining and extraction, those and shipping costs, those don't change. And then you've got the other half, which is all the tax, and there's a chunk out that can vary and change a little bit, but it doesn't change, rapidly week upon week. It's more of a sort of fix, and suddenly there might be a drop one year compared to the next, but it's it's planned, and they can see it. The rest of it is just people thinking that the price is going to they're betting on it, and that's the major issue. There is that there is no sustainability or even stability in knowing the price, which is one of those odd things about having a goal. Knowing that you're going to decrease something and say use less of it, let's take, say, fuel in itself, means that people know that there's going to be I say less fuel, you're going to be using less fuel. And so they're expecting, well, things to change, like the power mix, people are suddenly buying more greener electricity,
But they
and
can only do that if it's possible to buy it.
yes, I agree. That's yeah. But if you're saying you're phasing down, say, coal power, and you're saying, right, every coal being, not being powered, or we're building a turbine, you'll see, right, so that's one shovel equals an equal new turbine. So that's, and then you go through that way. You see, people say, right, so suddenly we're now not shoveling any coal, but and we've got enough wind turbines to take the capacity of the coal. That's great and dandy. So now, the coal industry, like, this presumably coal industry, suddenly had the chance to wind down and sort of to, basically take the workers out of the industry because they need less, and so you go, and suddenly it becomes not a dead industry, but an industry that has moved on. It's moved forward. It's actually progressed on to something else. Greener, which is the whole issue where we call these things currently in transition. How many times have you heard people say we're in transition over climate change? We're moving away from fossil fuels, or and then we say, oh, but the energy balance wasn't good, so we're having to transition back to fossils. All this terms, and basically is that we've gone halfway there, which is the first easy 50% effectively, and now we're struggling to go the next 40 or next 50 all the way down to zero because people aren't willing to commit to going that way.
Yeah, I agree. So where do we start? How are these targets set? So we've got a process of setting a target that basically someone starts this thing off. They've got this idea. They then develop that idea and they look at whether it is possible to do this sort of thing. Then they submit a report, and other people read this report and they say, oh, yes, this is okay. Now they communicate that round to everyone, and nothing happens.
Well, this is the whole. It is you've got to set the method of by doing things, but you've actually got to, let's say you commit to a method, of let's say the food waste, going back once again, is that right? The food waste, we're gonna put it in a big compost bin, so every bag of food waste goes in the compost bin.
Yeah, because you're taking the responsibility away from the individual there, saying that, yes, it would be nice if everyone does composting. Oh, can't be bothered. Okay, so let's see how much you can be bothered. We'll now give you a food bin and you put your food in that food bin.
And we'll
And
do the composting for you.
yeah, so that's making life a little bit easier for people. So they've only got to bother a little bit. So the only difference really they've got to do is instead of shoving everything in one bin, they've got to put it in 3, 4, 5 bins. And I know we went from a family of having just one bin in the house, and now we've got 3 bins in the house. And that's just in the kitchen. So when we just throw stuff away, rubbish goes in one bin, recycling stuff goes in another one, and food goes in another bin. And it's a workable situation. It's not really now any more effort. We've trained ourselves to actually do that. And it's achievable then, isn't it? We've got and a target can be achieved, and you can see it can be achieved, and we get some results from this. But how are we going to see we've achieved with a target of 1.5?
Well, the whole crux of this whole thing, of course, is the issue of this atmospheric concentration of CO2. Now, one of the major points of people say that if we could see CO2, we would do a much more to
Yeah.
change it. That's one of those things where you see the smog and you see the if you made it like a purple gas, which is what they commonly do, you can see all this air running around, and you can sort of say, well, we need less purple in the air. And then it's people saying, right, well, let's get rid of purple. But currently, because it is, I say gas, but it is in the air and it's relatively clear, it's not noticeable.
And I talk to my students and I say about carbon dioxide concentration 0.04%, and they go, "Oh, that's not very much. Why are people bothering anything about it?" And they don't relate that to climate change. We're going to have to stop there. Thank you very much for listening to our Going Green podcast. And we'll be back again next week looking at another topic about going green. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And a goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
Bye.